I want you to close your eyes for a moment and imagine a place that is supposed to be the ultimate safety net. A sanctuary built out of the very best intentions of a grieving nation. Picture a grand building standing tall against the skyline of a town famous for blood and sacrifice, a place dedicated to the most innocent victims of war. Now, I want you to imagine that behind those closed doors, the sanctuary transforms into a house of horrors, where the very people sworn to protect the helpless become the architects of their suffering. This isn't a fictional nightmare, and it isn't the plot of a dark fairy tale. This is the true, heartbreaking, and blood-curdling story of the Gettysburg Orphanage, a place that started as a beacon of hope and ended as a dungeon of despair. As we peel back the layers of history, be warned, the details are disturbing. The betrayal is absolute, and the justice was hard-fought. If you have ever felt powerless against a cruel authority, or if you have ever waited for the day that a bully finally gets what they deserve, then hit that like button, subscribe, and turn up the volume. You are about to hear one of the most harrowing tales of survival and retribution in American history. It all begins with a single, heart-wrenching moment on a battlefield soaked in blood. To understand the darkness that would eventually consume the orphanage, we first have to go back to the summer of 1863, to the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The air was thick with the smoke of black powder and the screams of the dying. The Civil War had reached a fever pitch, and the fate of the Union was hanging in the balance. Amidst the chaos of the first day of fighting, a Union soldier named Sergeant Amos Humiston found himself separated from his unit, fighting a desperate rearguard action to buy time for his retreating comrades. Amos wasn't a career soldier. He was a husband and a father from Portville, New York, a man who carried the weight of his family's future in his pocket. As the Confederate forces closed in, bullets whizzing like angry hornets, Amos was struck down. He fell near a picket fence on the edge of town, the life draining out of him onto the dry Pennsylvania soil. But in his final moments, as the noise of battle began to fade into a dull roar, he didn't reach for his weapon, and he didn't cry out in pain. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small tintype photograph. It was a picture of his 3 children, Frank, Frederick, and Alice, sent to him just weeks before by his wife Felinda. He clutched that image to his chest, staring into the eyes of the children he would never see again, and died alone on the field days later. When the guns fell silent and the gruesome work of burying the dead began, a local woman found Amos's body. There was no identification on him, no dog tags, no letters, just that photograph, gripped so tightly in his hand that it had to be pried loose by his stiffening fingers. The image was passed around until it reached a compassionate physician named Dr. John Francis Bournes. Dr. Bournes was deeply moved by the sight of the unknown soldier and his children. Here was a man who had taken his final breath thinking not of war, but of love. Dr. Bournes saw the tragedy not just as a solitary death, but as a symbol of the thousands of families shattered by the war. He made it his mission to find the widow Felinda and return the picture to her. Through the power of the press, the story of the children of the battlefield spread like wildfire across the North. It was a story that tugged at the heartstrings of a nation weary of death. When Felinda finally saw the description in the newspaper, her worst fears were confirmed. Her husband was gone. But from this seed of tragedy, a great oak was supposed to grow. Dr. Bournes, realizing that there were thousands of children like the Humiston orphans left destitute by the war, began to formulate a plan. He saw an opportunity to turn the symbol of the dead soldier into a lifeline for the living. Using the fame of the photograph, he raised funds to establish a permanent home for these children, a place where the sons and daughters of Union soldiers could be sheltered, educated, and loved. The location chosen was significant, a building on Baltimore Street in Gettysburg, right in the shadow of Cemetery Hill. This building had been a field hospital during the battle, a place of amputations and agony, but the vision was to redeem it, to turn a place of death into a place of life. On November 20th, 1866, the National Homestead at Gettysburg opened its doors, and in a poetic twist of fate, Felinda Humiston herself was hired as the first head matron. She brought her own 3 children to live there, standing as a mother figure for the lost souls of the war. For the first few years, it was exactly what it promised to be. The children were well fed, they went to school, they played in the yard, and the community embraced them. Even General Ulysses S. Grant came to visit, tipping his hat to the noble work being done. It seemed like a fairy tale ending to a tragic war. But fairy tales are often fragile things, easily shattered by the arrival of a wolf. In 1869, the dream began to fray. Felinda remarried and moved away to Massachusetts, leaving a void in the heart of the orphanage that would prove fatal. The board of directors turned to Dr. Bournes for a replacement. He recommended a woman named Rosa J. Carmichael. On paper, she seemed perfect. She presented herself as a strict disciplinarian with extensive experience in childcare, a woman who could bring order to the growing chaos of 50-plus rowdy children. But Dr. Bournes, perhaps blinded by his own desire to step back from the daily grind, didn't look too closely beneath the surface. He didn't see the coldness in her eyes, or the rigidity in her soul that mistook cruelty for discipline. In 1870, Rosa J. Carmichael took the keys to the orphanage, and almost immediately, the heavy oak doors slammed shut on a brighter future. The warmth that Felinda had cultivated evaporated, replaced by a chilling fear that settled into the very bricks of the building. Rosa was a woman who had never known love, and she seemed determined to ensure the children under her care didn't either. She was unmarried, childless, and seemingly devoid of maternal instinct. To her, the orphans weren't grieving children in need of comfort. They were nuisances to be controlled, laborers to be exploited, and sinners to be punished. The transformation was slow at first, insidious like a creeping rot. The quality of the food began to decline. The hearty home-cooked meals were replaced by watery gruel and stale bread. Clothes were mended until they fell apart, then left in tatters. The laughter that used to echo in the hallways was replaced by a suffocating silence. The children learned quickly that to speak was to risk punishment, to play was to invite pain. But Rosa wasn't satisfied with mere neglect. She needed to feel power, and she needed to break their spirits completely. She turned the basement of the orphanage, once a place of storage and laundry, into a dungeon. This was the epicenter of her reign of terror. Down in the damp, cold darkness, she devised punishments that were medieval in their cruelty. For the older boys, she had iron shackles bolted directly into the stone walls. They would be chained for hours, days even, their wrists raw and bleeding, standing in their own waste in the pitch black. But her true inventiveness of evil was saved for the smallest ones. The shackles were too big for their tiny wrists, so Rosa found a different solution. She would take a large barrel, fill it with freezing cold water, and force the child inside. Then, she would tie their wrists to the rim of the barrel, leaving them unable to sit or rest. They had to stand, shivering and exhausted, for hours on end. It was a torture designed to inflict maximum suffering without leaving a visible bruise. Then there was the pit. It was a small, windowless cubbyhole at the end of a narrow, rat-infested corridor. Children who dared to talk back or who committed the slightest infraction were thrown into the pit. They were stripped of their clothes, tied to the wall, and left in the absolute dark. The sound of rats scurrying across the floor became their only companions. Imagine the terror, the absolute panic of a child alone in the dark, listening to the claws of vermin coming closer, unable to move, unable to scream because they knew screaming would only make it worse. This was the daily reality of the Gettysburg Orphanage under Rosa Carmichael. But the horror wasn't confined to the basement. In the yard, children were tied to a split-rail fence under the scorching summer sun, left for hours while stray dogs, a pack Rosa encouraged to be aggressive, snapped and growled at their heels. The psychological torture was just as effective as the physical. She pitted the children against each other, turning the older ones into enforcers. One of these enforcers was a boy named Richard Hutchinson. The other children called him Stick Boy because he patrolled the halls with a switch, striking anyone who stepped out of line at Rosa's command. On the surface, Richard seemed like a traitor, a mini-monster in training. But inside, Richard was a prisoner of his own fear. He beat the others so he wouldn't be beaten himself. But there is only so much cruelty a human heart can witness before it breaks, or before it hardens into something unbreakable. Richard Hutchinson reached his breaking point not because of a beating, but because of the silence. He watched as his friends began to disappear, or worse, stopped coming back from the basement. The weight of his complicity became too heavy to carry. The sweet crime here wasn't a robbery or a heist. It was a conspiracy of the weak against the strong. It was a plot to escape hell and burn it down on the way out. The turning point began with a child named Robert Turner. Robert was a quiet boy, small for his age, an easy target for Rosa's rage. One day, after a minor transgression, Rosa dragged him to the cellar. No one saw him alive again. She told the other children he was sick. She told the board he had been sent to relatives. But the truth was far darker. She starved him to death in that basement and buried his body in the backyard under the cover of darkness. She thought she had gotten away with murder. She thought the earth would keep her secret. But secrets have a way of clawing their way to the surface. The tension inside the orphanage was reaching a boiling point. The children were starving, both for food and for affection. They were living on razor's edge, terrified that they would be the next one to vanish. Then came Christmas Eve, 1876. The town of Gettysburg was blanketed in snow. The church bells were ringing, and families were gathering in warmth and light. But at the orphanage there was only cold. Rosa, in a fit of perverse holiday spirit, decided to punish a young boy named Georgie London. She didn't put him in the pit. She didn't put him in the barrel. She dragged him outside, into the freezing wind, and locked him inside the wooden outhouse. She left him there, in the dark, in the filth, while the temperature plummeted below freezing. As Georgie sobbed and pounded on the door, his cries were heard by two men passing by on their way home from a church service. They were cemetery caretakers, men who knew the smell of death. They heard the desperation in that boy's voice, and they didn't walk away. They forced the door open and found Georgie, half frozen and barely conscious. That was the crack in the dam. The secret was out. Inside the orphanage, Richard Hutchinson saw the commotion. He saw the men carrying Georgie away. He saw Rosa's face, twisted in anger and fear. In that moment, Richard made his choice. He wasn't going to be stick boy anymore. That night, while Rosa slept, Richard did the unthinkable. He snuck out of his room, past the locked doors, and out into the night. He didn't stop running until he had covered 20 miles, all the way to the neighboring town of Waynesboro. There he found the authorities. He didn't just whisper. He shouted. He told them everything. He told them about the shackles, about the pit, about the barrels, about the dogs, and about the boy who was buried in the garden. Richard Hutchinson walked 20 miles through the night to save the people he had once hurt. It was an act of supreme courage, a redemption story written in blisters and exhaustion. The spring of 1876 brought the reckoning. The town noticed that the orphans were missing from the Memorial Day parade, a tradition they had participated in for years. The questions that had been whispered in the shadows were finally shouted in the light. The local chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic, the very veterans the orphanage was built to honor, stormed the building. They didn't find a sanctuary. They found a dungeon. When they opened the basement doors, the smell of decay and despair hit them like a physical blow. They found the shackles. They found the barrels. They found the pit, stained with the evidence of suffering. And they went to the backyard and dug up the remains of Robert Turner. The doctor entered the room where the town officials and the remaining board members were waiting, his face pale and his hands trembling. He looked at the men who had let this happen, the men who had trusted Rosa Carmichael, and he told them the truth. Robert Turner hadn't died of illness. He had starved. He had wasted away in the dark while they drank tea and patted themselves on the back for their charity. It was a dramatic reveal that shattered the town's illusion. The narrator of this tragedy, the collective voice of the dead and the living, had finally regained consciousness. And the scream was deafening. Rosa Carmichael was arrested. The trial was a spectacle, a catharsis for a community that felt betrayed. The testimony of the children, now free to speak, painted a portrait of a monster. Richard Hutchinson took the stand, his stick boy past laid bare, but his heroism celebrated. They described the cold, the hunger, the pain. Rosa sat in the courtroom, defiant to the end. She denied it all. She claimed the children were liars, that they were influenced by troublemakers. She claimed it was all a conspiracy to ruin her good name, but the evidence was irrefutable. The physical proof of the basement, the body of Robert Turner, and the frozen, traumatized body of Georgie London sealed her fate. She was found guilty on one count of cruelty for the outhouse incident. It seems laughable now, a slap on the wrist for years of torture. But in 1876, it was the harshest punishment the law could allow for a woman. She was fined $25 plus court costs and ordered to leave Gettysburg. She was banished, exiled from the scene of her crimes. But the story doesn't end with a gavel bang. Rosa Carmichael didn't just leave quietly. She refused to go. She stayed in the town for months, looming over the orphanage like a dark cloud, terrifying the children who thought she was coming back for them. And then, just as suddenly as she had arrived, she vanished. One night she was there, the next morning she was gone. No goodbye, no forwarding address. Her disappearance became the final mystery of the Gettysburg Orphanage. Some say she changed her name and moved to a new state, finding new victims to torment. Others say the good people of Gettysburg, tired of the law's failure, took justice into their own hands. The rumor mill churned with stories of a midnight raid, a rope, and a shallow grave in a lonely field. We will never know for sure. Rosa Carmichael stepped off the edge of the earth and was never seen again. But the justice didn't stop there. The spotlight swung from the matron to the manager, Dr. John Bournes. The man who had started it all with such noble intentions was exposed. Investigations revealed that while Rosa was beating the children, Bournes was beating the books. He had been skimming money from the donations, pocketing the funds meant for food and clothing to line his own pockets. The photograph of Amos Humiston's children, the symbol that had raised thousands of dollars, Bournes had sold it. He never even returned it to the family. The hero of the story was revealed to be a fraud, a profiteer of grief. The orphanage closed its doors for good in December 1877, a ruined shell of a dream. Today, the building still stands on Baltimore Street. It is a silent witness to the tragedy, preserved as a historic landmark. But the past is never truly dead. It lingers in the shadows, in the cracks of the plaster, and in the cold spots that no amount of heating can fix. Visitors to the orphanage report strange phenomena that defy explanation. They speak of sudden drops in temperature, an oppressive heaviness in the air that makes it hard to breathe. They hear the faint ghostly whispers of children crying in the empty rooms. Some say they feel small hands tugging at their clothes, desperate for attention that came too late. Others claim to see the apparition of a young girl in a tattered dress staring at them with sad eyes before fading into the wall. And then there are the sightings of Rosa herself, a tall, stern figure looming in the darkness, still patrolling the halls of her prison. Even the discovery of a child's rib bone during restoration work in 2025 reminds us that the soil here holds secrets we have yet to uncover. The story of the Gettysburg Orphanage is a scar on the American psyche. It is a testament to how easily good intentions can curdle into evil, and how the vulnerable are so often at the mercy of the powerful. But it is also a story of resilience. The children survived, they grew up, they moved on, and they carried the memory of those they lost. Richard Hutchinson, the enforcer who became a savior, proved that even in the darkest pits of hell, the human spirit can find a way to fight back. They didn't get a perfect justice. Rosa didn't suffer as she made them suffer, but they did get the truth, and the truth, as they say, will set you free. It set the children of Gettysburg free, and it ensures that even now, over a century later, we remember them. We remember Amos Humiston dying with a picture in his hand. We remember Felinda trying to build a home from the ashes of war. And we remember the monsters in human skin who tried to break them. If this story gave you chills, if you felt the anger rise in your throat at the injustice, and the relief at the escape, then smash that like button with the force of 1,000 freed orphans. Tell us in the comments what's the most satisfying revenge or justice story you've ever witnessed. We want to hear your thoughts. And of course, subscribe for more stories like this, where we dig into the dark corners of history to find the humanity underneath. Thanks for listening, and remember, even in the darkest pit, there is always a way out. I'll see you in the next one.